August 23rd,
1942. 500,000 German soldiers entered the city of Stalingrad on that fateful morning.
by February 2, 1943,
90,000 emerged in chains from the collapsed German 6th Army pocket. The German encirclement collapsed in 6 weeks of catastrophic miscalculation, compounded by every available factor. Watch, animated hour by hour, how Operation Uranus turned the largest army in the East into a corpse pile. Ace Blue was the German summer offensive of 1942, and it had 2 strategic objectives running simultaneously across a 1,000-mile front. The first was the Caucasus oil fields, which Germany desperately needed to sustain the war machine it had already built. The second was the Volga River at Stalingrad, which would cut Soviet supply lines running north from the Caspian Sea. These 2 objectives were not compatible with the manpower Germany actually had available in the summer of that year. Army Group South was split into Army Group A driving south toward the Caucasus and Army Group B driving east toward the Volga. Stalingrad was initially a secondary objective, a transit hub on a river bend, not an industrial fortress demanding total conquest. Hitler escalated Stalingrad from a flank-securing task to a prestige objective as the summer progressed, and consequences followed. The city's name made its capture politically non-negotiable in a way that logistics could not support at all. Army Group B's 6th Army, commanded by Friedrich Paulus, was ordered to take the city completely and hold the Volga bank.
by late August,
6th Army had reached the Volga north of the city, cutting off the land corridor from the north. The Luftwaffe firebombed the city on August 23 in a raid that killed tens of thousands and turned districts to ash. What remained was a labyrinth of reinforced concrete factory buildings, sewer systems, and rubble fields, defining the next 3 months. The German advance across the steppe to reach Stalingrad had been fast, sometimes 60 miles in a single day behind panzer spearheads. That speed created false confidence about what would follow inside the city's shattered industrial landscape waiting ahead. Street fighting at Stalingrad operated by rules the Wehrmacht had not been designed to follow, and the Germans learned slowly. The tank, which was the centerpiece of German combined arms doctrine, became nearly useless the moment it entered the factory district. Rubble channeled armor into kill corridors, and buildings provided Soviet infantry with overlapping fields of fire at close range. The tactic the Soviets developed, hugging the enemy, was deliberately designed to neutralize German fire superiority at every level. By closing to within 30 meters of German positions, Soviet infantry forced the Luftwaffe into an impossible targeting choice. The air support that had been decisive on the open steppe became inoperable in close urban contact with Soviet defenders. General Vasily Chuikov, commanding the Soviet 62nd Army inside the city, understood the defensive logic that would make survival possible. His doctrine was to close distance, fragment German units, and force every block into a separate tactical problem with no sweep. The factory district in the northern part of the city, Barricade, Red October, Tractor Factory, became a landscape owned by neither side. Soviet defenders would hold one floor of a building, while Germans held the floor above, sharing the same walls for weeks. By October, German units that had entered Stalingrad at full strength were operating at 30 or 40% of authorized manpower. The campaign was consuming the army it was supposed to be advancing, a fact visible in the supply and casualty arithmetic. The lines, stretching north and south of Stalingrad along the Don River, were held by the Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies. The Romanian formations were not inferior soldiers. They were under-equipped for the exact role they had been assigned to hold. Their anti-tank weaponry consisted largely of 37mm guns, entirely inadequate against the T-34's sloped armor profile. The Romanians had been promised German anti-tank support that never fully materialized in the quantities needed to cover their frontage. Soviet reconnaissance had identified the Romanian positions by October and fed that intelligence into the counteroffensive that was being planned. Soviet command spent the autumn accumulating reserves at precisely the points where the Romanian lines were weakest and most exposed. The frontage that Romanian Third Army held north of the Don Bend was approximately 150 kilometers of open steppe. A force holding that much ground with that anti-tank capability was not a defensive line. It was an obstacle to pass through.
German intelligence at Army Group B level
Understood the flanks were vulnerable and made that case to Hitler in October. Hitler declined, insisting that Stalingrad had to be taken first, and the flanks could be reinforced afterward when the city fell.
The offensive to take Stalingrad
Was to be completed before the Soviet flanking threat materialized. It was not completed in time.
November 19,
1942. The temperature on the steppe north of Stalingrad dropped to minus 18 degrees Celsius before dawn arrived. Then, the Soviet artillery opened fire along a 35-kilometer front, 3,000 guns firing for 80 minutes into Romanian positions.
when the barrage lifted,
Soviet tank columns moved through the fog and the smoke and through what remained of Romanian positions. The Soviet 5th Tank Army and 21st Army struck from the north, initiating the northern arm of Operation Uranus.
the following morning,
November 20th, the Soviet 51st and 57th Armies struck from the south through the Romanian 4th Army. The geometry was simple on the map and catastrophic in its execution. Two armored pincers converging on Calaci-on-Don, 60 miles back.
the Romanian lines
Did not hold. In some sectors, they collapsed within hours of the initial assault on the first day. Soviet tank crews reported driving 40 and 50 kilometers on the first day without encountering organized resistance along their route.
the speed of collapse
Exceeded even Soviet operational planning assumptions, catching their own logistics trailing behind the armor.
On November 22,
The northern and southern pincers met at Calaci. The encirclement of 6th Army was complete and sealed. Approximately 330,000 German and Axis soldiers were now inside a pocket roughly 60 by 40 kilometers in size.
the entire operation,
From the opening barrage to the closure of the ring had taken exactly 80 hours of continuous movement.
Paulus requested permission
To break out westward on November 23rd, a costly but technically possible operation at that moment. Hitler denied the request and ordered 6th Army to hold its positions as a fixed fortress, promising relief was coming.
This decision
Converted a dangerous situation into an irreversible one, and the animated maps make that conversion visible in real time. Speed was not the only factor, but the mismatch between Soviet execution pace and German decision pace was structurally decisive.
inside the pocket,
The Kessel, the immediate problems were fuel, food, and ammunition from the moment the ring closed. 6th Army had entered Stalingrad as a fighting force with forward supply lines running back through Romanian-held territory, now cut.
the daily ration inside the Kessel
Dropped almost immediately. By late November, soldiers received roughly 1,000 calories per day.
the temperature continued to fall
Through December, reaching minus 40 in some parts of the pocket's exposed steppe sectors. German winter equipment was inadequate because the army had never been re-equipped after the previous winter's catastrophic losses in Russia.
Chuikov's 62nd Army,
Still holding its Volga Strip, was now fighting from inside the encirclement outward toward the Soviet ring. German units inside the Kessel were simultaneously holding the shrinking pocket perimeter, maintaining city fighting, and sustaining morale under collapse.
Paulus
Reorganized his forces inside the pocket into defensive sectors, but was constrained by Hitler's orders to hold all ground. Every Soviet probe at the pocket perimeter required a response in place, burning fuel and ammunition that could not be replaced. Intelligence about the relief operation filtered into the Kessel through radio intercepts and courier aircraft carrying command messages.
This assumption
That relief would arrive before collapse would prove correct in one sense and catastrophically wrong in another. Army Group Don, newly created under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, was given the task of breaking through to 6th Army. Operation Winterstorm launched on December 12, 1942, with the 57 Panzer Corps as its primary armored spearhead advancing northeast.
the German advance
Initially moved faster than Soviet defensive preparations had anticipated, gaining ground in the first week.
by December 19,
The leading elements of 57 Panzer Corps had advanced to within 48 kilometers of the Kessel's southern perimeter. Manstein sent word to Paulus that Operation Thunderclap, the breakout, needed to begin immediately for the two forces to link up. Paulus again requested permission from Hitler to break out. Hitler again refused. Stalingrad could not be abandoned by the army holding it. The relief corridor that Manstein's force was holding open was at enormous cost, and it would not stay open indefinitely against Soviet pressure. On December 24, Soviet forces launched their counterattack against the Italian 8th Army to the northwest of Manstein's corridor. Manstein was forced to divert forces to contain this new threat, and the relief drive towards Stalingrad stopped definitively. The minimum distance between the relief force and the pocket perimeter when the advance halted was 48 kilometers. It never got closer. The window in which a breakout was feasible, December 19 to December 24, had closed. 6 days. That was the margin. Even under best-case assumptions, a post-December 24 breakout attempt would have required fighting through 48 kilometers in minus 30 temperatures. Hermann Göring had told Hitler in late November that the Luftwaffe could supply 6th Army by air, 300 tons per day. This promise was the foundation of Hitler's decision to hold the Kessel rather than permit an immediate breakout when it was possible. 300 tons per day required roughly 500 transport sorties daily. The Luftwaffe's available capacity barely covered half that number. The Luftwaffe had approximately 450 transport aircraft of all types on the Eastern Front, not all operational each day. Weather reduced operational availability further, often to below 30%, on days when fog or blizzard grounded the transport fleet. The airfields inside the Kessel, Pitomnik, and Gumrak could accept roughly 120 aircraft per day under ideal conditions. On the best single day of the airlift operation, December 19, the Luftwaffe delivered around 290 tons and never repeated it. The average daily delivery across the entire airlift period was approximately 100 tons, 1/3 of what Göring had promised. The gap between promise and delivery was not a correctable logistical failure. It was a structural impossibility any analysis would have revealed. The airlift was consuming aircraft and crews that the Luftwaffe needed across the entire Eastern Front for other critical operations. Transport crews, flying repeated sorties into Soviet-controlled airspace at low altitude, suffered casualty rates the Luftwaffe could not absorb. The airlift that was meant to save 6th Army was simultaneously consuming the assets the rest of the Eastern Front depended on. January 8, 1943. Soviet General Rokossovsky sent a formal surrender offer to Paulus, promising humane treatment for all who surrendered. Paulus forwarded the offer to Hitler with his recommendation that it be accepted. Hitler ordered him to reject it. The fighting would continue. Operation Ring, the final Soviet offensive to reduce the Kessel, launched on January 10, 1943, with the full Don front artillery. The Kessel that had measured 60 kilometers east to west in late November was now roughly 30 kilometers at its widest point. The soldiers inside were weakened by starvation, frostbite, and dysentery to the point where organized resistance was becoming difficult to sustain. Pitomnik airfield fell on January 16, ending the airlift in any meaningful operational sense for the forces inside the pocket. Gumrak held for a few days longer before Soviet forces overran it on January 22nd, ending all organized resupply into the pocket. The hospitals inside the pocket held 50,000 wounded soldiers who could not be evacuated and could not receive adequate care. On January 30, Hitler promoted Paulus to Generalfeldmarschall, a rank that signaled an obligation to die rather than surrender in the pocket. The following morning, January 31st, 1943, Paulus surrendered his southern headquarters group to Soviet forces in a department store basement. The northern pocket surrendered 2 days later, on February 2nd, completing the collapse of the entire German encirclement at Stalingrad. The final count of prisoners was approximately 90,000 from a force that had numbered over 300,000 at encirclement. Of the 90,000 taken prisoner in February 1943, approximately 5,000 survived Soviet captivity and returned to Germany. Army Group A, which had driven into the Caucasus under Case Blue, now had to withdraw rapidly to avoid being cut off in turn. The Caucasus oil fields that had been the campaign's strategic rationale were abandoned without being captured or significantly exploited. What the animated battle maps show, in aggregate, is a campaign made irreversible by decisions that could not be individually revisited. The split of Army Group South, the escalation of Stalingrad to prestige target, the denial of breakout, each locked in the next decision. The city that was entered by 500,000 soldiers in August was left by February holding the bones of everything else.